The Vikings didn't just appear in history, they exploded into it. Ships cutting through the fog, warriors stepping onto foreign shores, monasteries burning behind them. To the people of Christian Europe, they weren't just invaders, they were a nightmare. They looted sacred places, destroyed churches, and showed absolutely no respect for the religion that dominated the continent. And yet, just a few centuries later, something almost unthinkable happened. The very same Vikings who once tore down crosses would begin raising them. The followers of Odin, Thor, and Frey would slowly turn toward a completely different belief system, the religion of the people they once feared and fought. So what changed? Why would a culture built on warrior gods abandon them for a faith centered on humility and sacrifice? The answer isn't simple, and it definitely isn't what most people expect, because this wasn't just about belief, it was about power, survival, and a transformation that reshaped the Viking world forever.
Long before the Viking raids ever began, Christianity had already been trying to push its way into Scandinavia, but it barely made a dent. Early missionaries arrived with a clear goal: convert the northern tribes and bring them into the Christian world. But to the Vikings, these outsiders didn't just seem foreign, they seemed weak. Their message didn't resonate with a culture that valued strength, honor, and victory in battle above all else. One of the most notable figures was Ansgar, often called the Apostle of the North. He managed to establish small Christian communities and even converted a few individuals, but these efforts were fragile and limited. There was no widespread movement, no mass adoption, and in some cases the Vikings responded not with curiosity, but with violence. In 845, Viking forces attacked and destroyed Hamburg, one of the key centers for missionary work in the region. It was a clear message: Christianity wasn't welcome. At least, not yet. But despite these failures, something subtle had started. The idea of Christianity, once completely alien, had at least entered the Viking world, and that small seed would matter later more than anyone realized.
The first real shift didn't happen in Scandinavia itself. It happened abroad, far from the Viking homeland. As Viking warriors settled in foreign lands, especially in England and Francia, they found themselves surrounded by Christian societies. And in these places, conversion wasn't always about faith. It was about survival and opportunity. One of the most important moments came in 878, when the Viking leader Guthrum was defeated by King Alfred the Great. Instead of being executed or exiled, Guthrum was given a choice: convert to Christianity and rule peacefully, or lose everything. He chose conversion. Not long after, another Viking leader named Rollo made a similar decision. In 911, he agreed to convert in exchange for land and power, becoming the ruler of Normandy. These weren't spiritual awakenings, they were strategic moves, but they had consequences. Vikings back home began to see Christianity differently. It was no longer just the religion of their enemies, it was a gateway to power, legitimacy, and influence. And once that idea took hold, it became impossible to ignore.
At its core, the Viking conversion wasn't driven by belief, it was driven by advantage. Becoming Christian opened doors that were otherwise closed. It allowed Viking rulers to negotiate with powerful European kingdoms, form alliances, and participate in trade networks that were dominated by Christian states. But even more importantly, it changed the way power worked. In traditional Norse society, a king's authority depended entirely on strength, success, and loyalty. If he failed, he could be replaced. But Christianity introduced a completely different idea, the concept of divine right. A king didn't just rule because he was strong, he ruled because he was chosen by God. That idea was incredibly powerful. It made rebellion not just a political act, but a religious one. For Viking rulers looking to secure their position, this was a game changer. Christianity offered stability in a world built on uncertainty. And once leaders began to see that, conversion stopped being a risk and started becoming a strategy.
American figure represents this shift more clearly than Harald Bluetooth, the King of Denmark. According to legend, his conversion came after witnessing a miracle,
a Christian monk holding a piece of burning iron without being harmed. It's a dramatic story, but the reality was likely far more calculated. Harald wasn't just thinking about religion, he was thinking about control. Denmark at the time was divided, with rival factions constantly competing for power. Christianity gave him a tool to unify the kingdom under a single belief system. At the same time, he faced a growing threat from the south, especially from Otto I, who had both the military power and religious backing to justify an invasion of pagan lands. By converting, Harald removed that threat and strengthened his position internationally. But he didn't keep it quiet. He made his conversion public, building churches, raising rune stones, and even reburying his father with Christian rites. This wasn't just a personal decision, it was a national statement. And it marked the moment when Christianity stopped being optional and started becoming the new norm.
Americans' conversion was strategic. Norway's was far more aggressive. When Olaf Tryggvason came to power, he didn't just support Christianity, he enforced it. His approach was simple: convert or face the consequences. He traveled across the country, confronting local leaders, destroying pagan temples, and demanding allegiance to the new faith. Those who resisted didn't just disagree, they paid the price. Stories from the time describe harsh punishments, including torture and execution used to force compliance. Whether every detail is true or exaggerated, the message is clear. This was not a peaceful transition. After Olaf's death, there was a brief return to old beliefs, but it didn't last. Olaf II continued the process, pushing Christianity deeper into Norwegian society and eventually being remembered as a saint. By this point, the momentum had shifted. Even if people resisted, the direction was clear. The old gods were losing ground, and they weren't going quietly.
Sweden's journey was even more complicated. Unlike Denmark or Norway, it lacked a strong central authority for much of this period, which made widespread conversion far more difficult. Pagan traditions remained deeply rooted, especially in places like Uppsala, a major religious center tied to the old gods. When leaders tried to push Christianity too aggressively, the response wasn't passive, it was violent. One of the most dramatic examples came when a Swedish king attempted to suppress pagan rituals, only to be overthrown by his own people. His replacement openly supported the old beliefs, showing just how strong the resistance still was. But this didn't last forever. Power struggles continued, and eventually Christian rulers regained control. These conflicts weren't just about religion, they were about identity, tradition, and control. Sweden didn't flip overnight. It fractured, resisted, and fought its way through the transition, making it one of the most turbulent conversions in the Viking world.
Even after kings converted, the people didn't instantly follow. In reality, the shift from paganism to Christianity was slow, uneven, and often contradictory. For many, conversion was more about appearance than belief. Accepting Christianity could bring social advantages, avoid conflict, or simply align with those in power. But privately, many held on to their old traditions. It wasn't uncommon for someone to pray to Christ and still wear a symbol of Thor for protection. This blending of beliefs, known as syncretism, became a defining feature of the transition. Churches were often built near or on top of old sacred sites, allowing familiar traditions to continue under a new framework. Over time, these blended practices slowly leaned more toward Christianity, but the process took generations. This wasn't a clean break. It was a gradual shift where old and new existed side by side, sometimes in tension, sometimes in harmony.
By the time the 12th century arrived, the balance had finally tipped. Christianity was no longer a foreign influence or a political tool. It had become the dominant belief system across Scandinavia. This change wasn't marked by a single moment, but by a series of developments that made it permanent. Organized church structures were established, archbishops were appointed, and religious institutions became part of everyday life. The old pagan traditions didn't disappear overnight, but they slowly lost their place in society.
What once defined the Viking identity, loyalty to gods like Odin and Thor, was replaced by a new spiritual framework that connected them to the rest of Europe. And in the end, the transformation was complete. The Vikings didn't just adopt Christianity, they were reshaped by it. Their world, their power structures, and even their identity had changed. And the same people who once feared the cross had made it their own.
As time passed, the Vikings began to realize that the world around them was changing, and that if they remained isolated, they might lose more than they gained. Trade had always been a core part of Viking life, not just raiding. They traveled across vast regions from the Middle East to Western Europe, interacting with different cultures, most of which were Christian. And through this expansion, something became clear. Sharing the same religion made everything easier. Christian merchants were more likely to trust those who shared their beliefs, and deals moved more smoothly when there was common ground. Vikings who converted to Christianity found it easier to integrate into these trade networks, gaining access to wealth and opportunities that others couldn't reach. And that raised an important question for many back home. What if religion wasn't just about belief, but also about opportunity? Over time, this idea spread. Conversion to Christianity became not only a political or spiritual decision, but an economic one, a gateway to a wider world full of possibilities, and those who refused risked being left behind.
Despite all these changes, the truth is that the Old Norse gods didn't simply disappear overnight, and people didn't just wake up one day and forget them. The process was much slower and far more complex. The stories of Odin, Thor, and Freyr continued to be told, and the traditions connected to them survived, especially in rural and remote areas. Even after Christianity became the official religion, many people still felt a connection to the old gods, or at least saw them as part of their identity. But gradually, things began to shift. A new generation grew up with different beliefs. Churches became the center of daily life. Religious teaching spread, and the old rituals started to lose their meaning over time. Not just because they were discouraged, but because they no longer fit the way people understood the world. And as the years passed, the old gods slowly became stories, echoes of a past filled with power and myth. In the end, this wasn't just a religious change. It was the end of an entire worldview and the beginning of something completely new.